Part 3, AI and Fairness. In this section, we're going to move away from the first two parts, which were quite conceptual, and we're going to talk about fairness in the context of AI more concretely. So I'm going to motivate this by talking about high-profile cases of harm, which brought these kind of problems to the public consciousness. I'm going to talk more about the problem of fairness in AI, just again broadly. And then we'll talk about the AI ethics literature and various approaches to the problem of fairness and how people have tried to solve this, again, quite conceptually. And then I'm just going to problematize the section by saying, we need to make a decision on what kind of fairness we're talking about. So to begin, let's talk about some high-profile cases of harm. So there's two examples here from recruitment. One is the top left and the bottom right. So that image in the green is just an assessor and deciding on, who should get a job and who shouldn't get a job. It's just a kind of cartoon. And you can see that some people are being accepted and some people are being rejected. And if you will, the black box in the middle from the white dots on it and lines is the kind of assessment system. And a kind of concrete example of where that kind of system, which is excluding people arbitrarily and deciding people on factors that shouldn't be used to decide, was quite kind of famously seen in Amazon, where Amazon were purportedly using a recruitment system, a CV cipher, and it was just shown to be horribly horribly sexist and or choosing of particular genders over others. So another high-profile case of harm is that on the bottom left, which is from the criminal justice system. In the criminal justice system, there were algorithms that were being used to determine the likelihood that someone would reoffend, and it was shown to be racist. So the systems were taking black individuals who had committed kind of petty crimes and was just ranking them as very high risk, and it was taking white candidates who had committed very serious crimes and who were reoffenders and so on, and ranking them as low risk. And it was shown that the reason for this was because of, let's say, a kind of racial bias, which was just based on historical precedents and so on and so forth. It was carrying these biases into the assessment. Another final example is that of Microsoft Hey, which is a chatbot that was developed, that was feeding off people's responses or how people were acting, how people were interacting with the chatbot, and it was reflecting those interactions, and it was just sprouting out the most horrible, sexist, racist kind of assertions. So there's all these kind of great high-profile cases of harm, which really motivated this problem of, hang on a minute, what's the ethics of these systems, and more importantly, are these systems fair? Are they reflecting a kind of equality that we would want to be reflected in such systems? So let me talk about the actual problem, let's say AI's fairness problem. So the whole kind of course, I guess, is addressing this. So let me just introduce this by, instead of talking maybe about the system itself, let's talk about humans. So humans are unfair. Lots and lots of human decision making is just, riddled or rife with bias and unfairness. So let's just kind of caveat that and say, when we're talking about AI's unfairness problem, we're talking about the problem of fairness more generally, and about problem of fairness in decision making. And AI is a kind of, assisting decision making, or even in some cases decision making systems. So it also has this problem of bias. In, if you will, comparison to human beings, because these systems can work really quite rapidly, can work at scale. Another problem that AI introduces is amplification risk, which is that, let's say a system is biased, it can, a particular AI can make far more decisions. The rate of decision making is far higher than, and the scope may be far more wider than human decision making. So that's another issue, which we're not going to talk about, but it's something that should be definitely considered in your minds. And finally, let's think about it maybe positively, and let's say when we're having these discussions, when we engage in this whole thing, is it possible that that maybe the use of these systems in some contexts might actually make systems fairer? We might actually be able to introduce a greater level of equality than let's say human decision making. And I'm just giving an example there, which is a very funny study, which was done in the US, and it's kind of anecdotal almost, but the conversation is, so the study was about the decision making of judges on Fridays, and it was showing that if you're making a decision on a Friday afternoon, the judge is more likely to kind of hurry the case or decide in ways which are not typical of how the judge would have decided in other days of the week. So here you're showing something quite arbitrary in the decision making or the fairness or unfairness of judges. And we're saying, well, hang on a minute, is there a way for us to use these AI systems in ways that might be better than that? So can we think of it as an opportunity? So let's talk about, at first, there's lots and lots of literature on this, and I'm not going to spend too much time because most of your course is going to discuss these kind of problems. But we might say, where's the problem? So one of the big problems, if you will, or the sources of bias are the training data. So there's these examples from MRI. MRI is a scan that's done on the body. I think it's the soft tissue. And you do MRA to scan for things like tumors, hernias, and things like this. And it's been shown that, well, there were cases which were shown where the system was trained just on men, and then when it was applied to women, it wasn't working very well. So the data set was skewed towards men. So the MRI was not performing well for women or female bodies. So second one is model, which is just about how do we structure and how do we classify certain terms, etc. Let's say, for example, someone's been tagging or someone's been using particular examples, and we've always associated or classified nurse as female, and we classify doctor as male. Here we'd be showing kind of gender bias. And also a major source of bias is the team. A lot of people talk about this, and there's a big concern here. And I think that it's quite layered actually, which is, if the team isn't diverse, how can we hope that we're not going to have bias in the system? I think that's important. That's the team developing the system and also overseeing the system. One of the concerns here, one of the issues is more generally about, even if we have a diverse team, we might still have bias, or even if we have models that the classifiers are balanced, we still might have bias. Even if we have a balanced data set, we still might have bias. So the big kind of takeaway here is not to say that there is a single source of bias or that there's a kind of simple way of addressing this by intervening at one of these points, but certainly these are very important points in the kind of story of bias. So now let's talk about AI ethics. Now, AI ethics, if you will, emerges as a result of, let's say, a greater consciousness. I spoke at first about the high-profile cases of harm, and it's, if you will, it's a kind of conglomerate. I refer to it as AI ethics, but a lot of people refer to this literature in terms of things like responsible AI, trustworthy AI, etc. But what's really driven it is the kind of ubiquitous adoption of these new technologies. The focusing on AI ethics, because there's a lot of work in the broader AI ethics. We can think of, in digital ethics we can think of in terms of an umbrella term, to include the ethics of things like blockchain or IoT or the internet even. And the kind of AI ethics became much more differentiated or specific in its focus on artificial intelligence or machine learning. One of the big turning points was the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which was the manipulation of the democratic process, where it was with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica as a system which was targeting, purportedly it's referred to in terms of voter manipulation. So that really shone a big light on it, and I think AI ethics really got kind of supercharged in that context. AI ethics more generally is very, very interdisciplinary. So, for example, the group that I work in is engineers, there are lawyers, there are people from education, there are people with a philosophy background, and so on and so forth. So it's very interdisciplinary. And there are different sources, if you will, or kind of, it's not, let's say the ethics of technology is not something new. There are different kind of sources that feed into, streams that feed into this discipline. And the first one is engineering ethics. So these are kind of self-assembled communities. Let's say the Royal Society of Engineers is an example of that. And these engineers have kind of expressed their codes of practice, their values, and that literature very much feeds into the AI ethics literature from the engineering perspective. There's a philosophy of technology. I kind of tongue-in-cheek have put doom and gloom there. It's quite negative. It's very much about kind of things. It comes from the philosophy, from the philosophical work of the academy. It's kind of 20th century fear of kind of nuclear oblivion, alienation, loss of nature. You know, the kind of commodification of everything through technologies, the uniformity of culture, and so on and so forth. So it's very negative. So that feeds into it. And then there's a kind of STS, which is science and technology studies, which is a very empirical as well as theoretical way of approaching the problem of technology and AI ethics, which is to say, hang on a minute, when we think of an AI system or any technology system, we should think of it as value laden, which just means that it's not something neutral, that these systems are very much expressions of value systems, and we can't just think of it as a kind of passive tool that we just pick up and use here and there. I put utopian and dystopian, and I think the reason why I say this is that I think there are kind of ideological camps, if you will. One of them is very tech positive. It's, you know, more than that, it's saying these technologies are going to solve humanity's problems, are going to really move humanity forward in this way or that. And the second kind of group is dystopian, which I've referred to there in terms of moral panic, which is, oh no, the robots are taking over, AI is going to lead to the kind of enslavement of human beings to machines. It's going to be the loss of autonomy and so on and so forth, loss of freedom. So AI ethics, which addresses fairness, and you can see in the image on the right that it's not just about fairness, but very much the fairness of AI, if you will, falls into this literature of AI ethics. It's a burgeoning field, it's a big field, and it's been, if you will, it's under this remit that the discussions of how to address AI, the fair problem of fairness in AI has fallen. So in this capacity, there's been a real push for a principled approach to AI ethics, to say, okay, are there these sets of principles that people should follow or consider when developing or deploying a system, an AI system? First thing to say is that there's been lots and lots of publications in this space. There's like over 100, various AI ethics principles or statements of principles. They come from industry, they come from government, they come from civil society, and so on and so forth. And on the right, Jobin has this brilliant article by Anna Jobin has just kind of mapped or reviewed how these various terms in these statements of principles have lots of synonyms and how they need to be kind of disambiguated. So let's take the example of justice and fairness, which is in the second column. You can see lots and lots of terms there: equality, equity, redress, remedy, fairness, justice, access and distribution, diversity, plurality, etc. So this brings us on to the point that, you know, it's very, very ambiguous. And I'm going to really explore that in the coming slide. But just before we do that, just a more broader kind of bird's eye view, the principled approach is very incongruent, which just meant that, let's say, for example, you have a statement of principles, and one of the principles will be a system needs to be transparent and open. And then like 3-4 sentences later, you'll see the statement or the principle, a system needs to be private and, you know, respect privacy. And obviously a system can't be both open and private, or it's very difficult to be able to kind of balance that. So this is what we meant by incongruent. Another problem, if you will, from this literature was that this is just machine learning or AI is built by engineers, software engineers. And, you know, you need to be able to operationalize this. So if you want to have a kind of ethical code that you can't act upon, it's not very useful. So the problem of operationalization is a big, big problem. And the reason why operationalization has been a problem and it continues to be a problem is that the terms are quite vague, as you can see. The terminological confusion, as you can see, justice and fairness is an umbrella. The notion of diversity, polarity, and I don't know, reversibility are not necessarily very close, so it's very confusing. So these are very non-trivial for the engineer to actually execute on. This is the kind of paradigmatic example. So there was this work done by Verma, and it was just a kind of mapping, if you will, the problem of fairness, or the fairness principles. So here, putting aside, let's say, the incongruence between the different principles that were being expressed, you had an even deeper problem of, let's say we just stuck to fairness and we just looked at all of the various expressions of fairness. Could we reduce them to one another? So what do we mean by that is just, maybe they were just tautological, or they were just different ways of expressing the same thing and so on. So they tried to reduce these definitions, and they found in their study that there were 23 irreducible definitions. That's a lot of definitions of fairness in the context of machine learning or algorithmic engineering. This was a big problem. And I just want to make a comparison with the kind of, and I put there, messy human approaches. We have lots and lots of contradictory approaches to if you will, fairness, and it's okay. So in our legal tradition, even in ourselves, we have all these different concepts of fairness, and we just apply them in different contexts. And the problem with automation is that you can't do that. It's very difficult to do that. You're hard coding these kind of things into the system itself. So another approach, aside from principles, was, can we do ethical by design? So there's lots and lots of different approaches to ethical by design. And ethical by design, if you will, at a very high level, is just to think about, can we design the system in a way which performs ethically? So it's actually something to do with the engineering itself, or can be overseen and so on. So one approach was to say we need to have a code design, so we need to ensure that non-engineers are present, ethicists, I use that in very loosely, lawyers or whoever else has a kind of expertise outside of the engineering space but focuses on these issues of fairness or justice. Maybe that the systems need to be built in a particular way, in an open way, in an explainable way, in a way that can be justified, so they can be audited. And lots and lots of practical manuals were published in this context, where people were giving practical guides to how we can actually build these systems. So this was the kind of ethical by design approach. Again, it has its own problems. Was it very useful? Were those practical guides useful? I've engaged a lot with industry, and a lot of the more high-profile publications in the space, I didn't really see them being used. So this is not, again, it's not trivial at all. So let's kind of close this section of the course by talking about which fairness. So first, let's think very carefully about when we highlighted that we have mutually exclusive, that's what I meant by irreducibility, definitions of fairness. I mean, what do we do about that then? So how do we make that decision? Do we just call the ethicist and say, make that decision on our behalf, and then we can engineer it? So what do we do about it? So one approach is to say, let's do that. Let's just pick one, let's bite the bullet and just go with that. Okay, you can do that. Another approach is to say, okay, maybe we need to respect the different definitions, and just like we do as human beings, we need to look at the context, and according to the context, we need to prioritize a particular definition of fairness. So another approach. Another one is to say, okay, what are acceptable and unacceptable notions of fairness within reason? So you can have reasonable pluralism while still excluding some definitions. So one example here is the Equality Act in the UK, which defines 9 protected characteristics. And you might say that, okay, as long as you fall within these kind of boundary conditions, then fine, fair enough. You can choose a definition of fairness that kind of reasonably fits into to what people, as a consensus, would say is an acceptable definition. And finally, we've got to say, okay, big questions about who discerns or who's deciding which kind of system is, what's the appropriate context or what's the appropriate, is it humans, is it machines? We talk about democratic legitimacy. We talk about kind of, authorization of making that decision making. And why is that important? Because we're saying, okay, is an engineer the best person to make this decision? Even in quotes, an ethicist, is that a kind of official position? Should it be judges making these decisions? And finally, and this was a really another kind of sticky point, is let's say this kind of flips the problem. If a decision is being made by an AI or machine learning, and the judges don't actually understand how those decisions have been made, is that a problem if the judges don't get it, if they're not qualified or competent to actually understand the decision-making process? So, I mean, a lot of people address that by pushing for explainability and transparency, but that's a big problem. So, which fairness, which tradition of fairness, how do we accommodate reasonable difference of opinion on this problem, etc., etc. So this is the big problem. So thank you.